Thank you, Joe. Absolutely delighted to be joined by everyone on this call, and of course, Jonathan, of whom I am a huge fan and who has been a great mentor, not only to me, but lots of young climate activists in the space. I think it would be best if we kicked off, Jonathan, with hearing a little bit about your motivation for writing the book and a quick whistle-stop tour through some of the chapters for anyone who hasn't had the opportunity to read it yet.
Thanks, Clover. Yeah, and it's really nice to share this occasion with you, to be honest, because the motivation for this book goes back to the early part of 2019, in reality. If anybody can remember what it was like in 2019, pre-COVID-19, but 2019 was an extraordinary year. There was this explosion of concern and interest about climate change, in particular coming from Extinction Rebellion, here in the UK to begin with, but then spreading internationally. But for me, even more significantly, the brilliant arrival of Greta Thunberg and her own extraordinary kind of leadership in our midst, and the growth of the school strikes, the Friday school strikes, and youth climate activists, so that we went in the course of about 15 months from young people being concerned but not visible to older people, to 7 million young people on the streets of towns and cities around the world by the end of 2019. I mean, that's one of the most astonishing explosions of interest in a cause that I've never seen anything like it in my life, and I've been at this for a very long time. So for me, this was just unbelievable. But also, it reminded us all of this perhaps complicated notion of intergenerational justice. What does one generation owe the next generation and all generations to come after that? And if ever there was a really worrying example of how one generation has betrayed following generations, climate change provides that example. By virtue of us having ignored the science of climate change since the late 1980s, and I don't want to rub that in, but that really is the truth of it. We knew pretty much everything that we needed to know about the science of climate change in the late 1980s. We really did. And that led, of course, to the critical moment of the Earth Summit in 1992, when the Framework Convention on Climate Change was signed. And pretty much all, the entire world said, yep, this is the moment we're going to do something about it. And then somehow that didn't happen. So for me, this is an issue of justice. It's an issue of injustice between people of this generation and injustice between people of different generations. And although I've written quite a lot about sustainability over the years, I've never really put my finger on this indivisibility between social justice and environmental justice. You can't split the two out. Weirdly, for me, most of my life has been dominated by people who either talk primarily about social justice and their concern about human rights and their concern about development and their concern about what we should be doing for the billions of people on the planet today who don't have even the basics that we take for granted. Or, on the other hand, people who talk about the environment and are distraught at the damage we're doing to the natural world and can't understand why politicians continue to allow that pattern of destruction to continue. But the numbers of people who actually put these two things together indivisibly, two sides of the same coin, far fewer. And I wanted to write the book, I wanted to write Hope in Hell, to address that issue, to respond to the mandate that Extinction Rebellion gave us, which is tell the truth. We've probably forgotten that catchphrase now, but it sounds a bit naive. But honestly, if people really do focus on the truth, the scientific truth of climate change, they will see the world very differently. And then to go on and remind people that it is not yet too late. We actually have it within our means today to narrow the gap between what the science tells us, which is deeply, deeply gloomy. And we won't be able to avoid some of that this evening, Clover, because it's impossible to avoid it altogether. And this extraordinary solutions portfolio, the amazing array of things that we could be doing to put right, to address some of these climate-related problems in our midst. And then right there in the middle, you've got this issue about how do you narrow the gap between what the science tells us we should be doing, what the solutions allow us to do, and practically nothing happening in the middle. And of course, that is a political issue, and Hope in Hell, in the end, is a political book. It is about political activism and what we need to do to narrow the gap. And I'm sure you and I can come on and talk a bit about that, because both of us are pretty focused on narrowing that gap between what we know we should be doing and what we could be doing if we were able to get enough political will into that space. And for me, that's where the dynamic about young people comes into its own, because if we have another 10 years of business as usual incrementalism in addressing the climate change, that is another decade of betrayal. So I'm very focused on this window of time that we have to narrow the gap, basically. And that's why I am working a lot more with young people and seeing how I can be helpful in terms of the contribution they have started to make and is already so influential, basically.
Thank you, Jonathon. One of my favorite quotes from the book is that there is no hope in another 10 years of incremental change. And I think throughout the book, you toe this line incredibly between falling into a state of despair and being, you know, falsely optimistic. You manage to find somewhere in that kind of messy middle. But, you know, you spoke to this kind of division and polarization between social justice, environmental justice. One of the great polarizations on a psychological level in society today is denialism versus kind of false optimism. And in false optimism, I think about a lot of the kind of techno-utopian solutions that are presented, you know, to solve the climate crisis. I would be curious to hear from you, you know, having been on the front lines of this movement for a few more decades than I have, how you've managed to navigate that emotional landscape and maintain this kind of this optimism grounded in reality. Because, you know, honestly, there were a few times reading the book where I had to kind of put it down and take a deep breath, because it's scary, overwhelming stuff. So I would be curious to hear about how you've navigated that and how you continue to, without kind of vacillating between these polarities.
Yeah, it is difficult, and actually I don't find it easy to do. It's something I have to work out the whole time, because like you, my inbox is full of stuff all the time about why things are getting worse. And we've just had this dreadful episode in the Arctic, as you know, a couple of weeks ago. Literally unbelievable temperatures, 38 degrees centigrade in parts of Siberia. Temperatures equivalent to what it would be like in Abu Dhabi. And, you know, people are sort of looking at that and saying, whoa, how can anybody talk about hope when the speed of change is as bad as it is? And I don't deal with that easily. I have to be honest. I have to think about what that means all the time and recalibrate against the speed of change. But what I do know is that, and this is where I suppose I'm quite angry about techno-optimists, because the really weird thing is that techno-optimism, which is offered to people as, don't worry, it's all going to be okay, we'll technologize our way out of it. That kind of techno-optimism is the worst enemy of good technology. Literally the worst enemy. Because we can look to technology to make an incredible difference to these issues. And we may want to pursue this in more detail, but I've been doing quite a bit of work on this during lockdown. And there's no doubt that if we treated the climate emergency with the same degree of purpose as governments are forced now to address the coronavirus crisis, we could easily get to 100% renewable electricity for the whole of the world by 2030. I know that is a kind of gobsmacking thing to say, and I'm not a scientist, I'm not an engineer, you know, I'm just a green activist, as it were, but really and truly the speed of change with these renewable energy technologies is extraordinary. So 100% renewable electricity by 2030. Now, all that does is create the foundation on which we can then make all the rest happen, including the difficult social justice stuff, much harder social justice issues. But I suppose I keep in my mind, the way I keep despair at bay is by looking at what the resources are on the other side of the balance sheet and how we can then use those resources to address some of these much more fundamental issues about the economy, about how we see ourselves, about humanity, basically, not just technology. And if I can keep that frame going, I can more or less keep a kind of psychological equilibrium.
And you talk quite comprehensively in the book around, tipping points. And I think it's a concept that we humans are getting much better at grasping. On one level is, instead of these linear trajectories, the exponentials of what can happen when we exceed certain climate tipping points. On the flip side of that, I would be curious to hear from your perspective what you perceive to be positive kind of tipping points. Where do you identify within the system opportunities for, collectives to come together and create forces for good that are unstoppable?
Yeah, I mean, that is such an important part of what I call authentic hopefulness, is looking to the balance between physical tipping points and social tipping points. And to be honest, I really did think at the end of 2019 that we were getting very close to what I call a socioeconomic tipping point, where enough people seemed to have awoken to the real present danger caused by accelerating climate change in their midst, and were insisting that politicians should do a great deal more about it. Let's not forget, to be fair, that the UK was the first major government in the world today to declare a net zero economy by 2050. Now, put to one side the fact we know that's inadequate and all the rest of it, we did it. And the reason why the government then did it was because of what was going on through Extinction Rebellion and through young climate activists making their views so widely heard. This political action, people sometimes get very cynical about this. This action really, really counts and makes a huge difference. And I've talked a couple of times in the book, as I know you're very familiar with this, Clover, about the work of Erica Chenoweth and her analysis about what it takes to see a sufficient momentum building in society to use quite small minorities of people, in effect, to lever tremendous change as a consequence of that. And maybe we shouldn't make too much of that, but I am absolutely persuaded that there is a social tipping point, which is the equivalent of some of the physical tipping points that we are getting very dangerously close to in the natural world. And that's one of the stories that I think for young people is critical, because that's not an easy balancing act to keep going. If all that's happening is you're being bombarded with the physical tipping points, and you kind of think, oh my God, how are we ever going to tip our ridiculous incumbency-based political systems to address that properly, then despair actually is not far away, if that's how you see the world. And I know some of your work is addressing that head on, is how you actually begin to think about navigating your way through those incredibly difficult sets of data coming at you all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's in the context of having come at such an early age. I remember first reading about climate change when I was about 11 years old, and I had that kind of Greta Thunberg moment, which is, why is this not the conversation of every dinner table? Why aren't we talking about it left, right, and center? And It's awesome because, young people, we have the benefit of not having become complacent toward the systems in which we operate, because we're coming at them afresh, right? In the context of the climate crisis and climate emergency. And so with that, we can see what is possible, and we see what is needed by way of kind of reinvention. But drawing on this idea of kind of despair and building up our emotional resilience, one of the things that filled me with hope was obviously the youth strikes for climate. Equally, one of the things that filled me with quite a bit of dread was what happened in the wake of them. And there were many conversations I had with young climate activists who, in the wake of protests, felt this enormous feeling of powerlessness.
Yeah.
When they looked to people in positions of power, institutions of power, and saw them not responding with the clear urgency that all of the science demands. And so my question to you, and I think you're in an especially interesting position, having come from the Green Party and seen seen firsthand, you know, incredible positive action taken as a result of your campaigning and lobbying, but then also seen that reverse, how your perspective on power has evolved over the course of your career. And if you speak a little bit to how those dynamics must change. I was speaking to Fahana Yaman, who you know, the other day, and she was saying that, you know, power does not give itself up. So I'm really curious to hear a little bit more on your perspective of nonviolent direct action, but also the role in more young people and more of civil society kind of stepping up to the plate to take ownership of the decisions that are being made that are going to affect each and every one of us.
Yeah, and I think you've put that in exactly the right way, because one phenomenon I'm really nervous about is older people dumping the burden of this on younger people and saying, look, we did our best and we had a good shot at it. It didn't quite work. We got quite close on a couple of occasions, but actually we're still a bit stuck. But now, you guys, you've just got a different way of doing it. You can sort it out. And when I hear that, that does make me pretty cross, I have to admit. But the only answer to that question, Clover, is that political incrementalism, step by step, small changes to a basically unjust, unsustainable economic model will not get us to the place that we need to be. In fact, if we just continue with climate politics as we've known it for the last 30 years, we will not create conditions for a stable climate for all generations to come. So I've looked at that completely logically. No, I'm not trying to do this ideologically. I've just looked at what the process of political change means today. And I know that if we just continue on the same track now for the next 10 years through to 2030, then it's kind of game over. And I don't want to dramatize that, but it's already too late to avoid, as you know, really significant disruption. It's not too late to avoid runaway climate change. But it will be too late if we don't change the political dynamic. And for me, that means, without a shadow of doubt, much more radical political activism. It means people being prepared to take steps which some people will see as threatening, as dangerous, as subversive, including nonviolent direct action. I think it necessitates a birthing of mass civil disobedience in society all around the world. And I certainly don't mean that it's only young people who should bear that burden. I'm looking to the understanding between different generations that we have to share that burden now. We've created the burden, and we have to work with young people to see what we can do to make sure that the burden is as little painful as it needs to be. I suppose I might say I'm a bit struck by Jane Fonda. I know this will be a weird sort of comparison for people to hear, but Jane Fonda, who's been a political activist throughout her life, let's not forget that, and in a way that I have always admired, decided at a certain point that the injustice of asking young people to sort this out was completely unacceptable. And at that point decided that she would, join forces with young people's organizations in the USA and would be prepared to get herself arrested as a consequence of that. And she stuck to her guns on that. Sorry, bad metaphor. She has absolutely stayed true to her word. She's kind of said, this is too serious now. And I'm very taken with that. And I think a lot of older people, including myself, will have to accept the logic of what political radical action means today. And it means civil disobedience of many different kinds.
Mm. And I mean, speaking to that and speaking to, the arrests that take place with nonviolent direct action, and in the context of the Black Lives Matter movement, as you touched on earlier, many environmentalists, and you obviously speak about it in the book as well, are waking up to the realization that we've allowed social justice to be relegated to the sidelines, even though we will not deliver climate justice without that being front and center of the conversation. So I would be curious to hear your perspective on how some of these, conversations, for one, in the climate space need to move outside of closed door rooms, but also how to create a much wider invitation. And it's one of the things that kind of excites me about climate change is that, even though it's the greatest threat, the flip side of how royally we've kind of messed up the planet is how many ways there are to help it. And yet we have an obligation, a responsibility to create a much greater plethora of invitations for people to step into that equation. It is our future ultimately. And, the people who are custodians of the solutions often aren't going to be those wearing the suits. They're going to be people who are coming from the grassroots. So I'd be curious to hear a little bit about what your observations have been in terms of change coming from that place, right? And that dynamic shifting, and where you see opportunities. And, also I think the Green New Deal gives me a lot of hope. And that is also because I think on the opposite side of these kind of dystopian stories that we're constantly exposed to, where everyone's desperately craving a vision of what is possible. And there's that quote that, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is the end of capitalism. What does that vision need to manifest as, so that we can really see what it is that we're working toward and how that will benefit all tiers of society and everyone in this, 7.8 billion piece puzzle?
So the future of life on Earth, the future of capitalism.
Sorry, that was spaghetti on the wall. I threw a lot at you there.
Everything else thrown into good measure. But one of the things that really does strike me very forcefully, Clover, when I'm talking more with young people in my age group, is that young people find it unbelievable that my generation didn't see social justice and environmental justice as two sides of the same coin. Just weren't there. The environment movement was not based on that deep understanding. The Green Party, to be fair to the Green Party, and I joined the Green Party in 1974, and I care passionately about the Green Party, always put justice alongside environmental sustainability. But paradoxically, the only other country to do this really well has been the United States. And the environmental justice movement in the USA has been astonishing over a very long time. And although we look to the kind of Washington elite group of environmental NGOs, I don't want to polarize too much here, but very much dominated by Washington politics, very much dominated by a sort of sense of white elitism, let's be honest, never ever understood what was going on in many other parts of the country, particularly in the South, where this imposition of a model of industrial development fell disproportionately on communities of color, year after year after year, causing astonishing damage. And what I find unbelievable now and really brilliant is the way in which this is creating, and as you put it a minute ago, a kind of nexus of concern and a realization that these are things that can't be put into separate boxes. For me, I think your analysis is the right place to start. I think my generation is still struggling with this, But look, I don't think I can give a quick answer on the future of capitalism here. All I know is that having written a book about the future of capitalism, that whatever emerges out of this next few years, it isn't going to be capitalism as we have known it for the last 40 years. It is going to be completely indistinguishable. And it will have at its heart, and I do absolutely passionately believe this, it will have it at its heart a concept of justice as the foundation of what we need to do in terms of our relationship with the natural world, our relationship with each other, our relationship between different communities and so on. Justice is actually the nub of this. Justice is the concept on which sustainability rests.
Absolutely. If we're to reflect for a moment on the current situation, living through a pandemic, this will make sense. It might be a circuitous route, but Yuval Noah Harari talks about the one thing that kind of distinguishes humans from other species is our ability to subscribe to different fictions and tell stories. And one thing that's quite powerful is when we appreciate that neoliberalism, capitalism is ultimately a mythology in our society that we're opting to subscribe to. And in the context of COVID, I think it has brought into acute awareness, the fragility of many of these systems. And we see the opportunity then in a very tangible way by way of government stimulus packages, where we're able to, direct funding, taking this moment of kind of societal pause to think about what it is that we do want to leave behind and what it is that we want to invite into the future. I would be really curious to hear about your perspective, because you do touch on this in the book, of these kind of incumbents, and back to this quote of there, being no hope in another 10 years of incremental change. One of the things that infuriates me, whether it's scrolling through Facebook or attending COP, is the level of blatant greenwashing. I'd be curious to hear your perspectives, your thoughts on the role of incumbents in stepping up. And in response to one Q&A that just came through, one question, whether we can begin to engage, or whether we should seek to engage these big oil companies, or if they're inherently preventing change.
Yeah. I feel it is so important not to be naive about the nature of the political challenge we face, and there is a chapter in the book, as you've just mentioned there, Clover, on this whole question of incumbency, because this is a form of deep political power where politicians are combining forces with the big oil and gas companies, essentially with the carbon intensive industries that have made our economy prosper over the last 50 years at great cost to the planet, it has to be said. That incumbency between politicians and the carbon intensive industries today is unbelievably powerful. Unbelievably powerful. And then you have to take into account that they've also got most of the global media on their side as well, because they ensured, as part and parcel of the ideological work that they did, I hope this doesn't sound too much like a conspiracy theory, but they really worked unbelievably hard to get Fox and Murdoch and everybody else on board with the game plan. And they're still on board with the game plan. Don't forget, they may occasionally pay lip service to the idea there's a slightly different reality in town, but deep down, they are still about defending the interests of a very, very narrow, tiny elite of super wealthy people in the global economy today. So I come at this from that political perspective. That makes a lot of people uncomfortable, but I don't know how else you could read the story of the world, coming back to that notion of narratives. How else can you read the story of the world if you don't take that position, where millions of people have thrown in their lot with a group of politicians who actually were only out to exploit them further rather than in any way make life better for them. And this is true in the USA, it's true in the UK, it's true in the Philippines, it's true in Russia, it's true in Brazil. You look around the world, you've got this bunch of populist autocrats, elected democratically or not, who claim to be interested in making life better for the poor and the disenchanted and all the rest of it. Actually, they've just made life massively worse for all of them. So let's not have any illusions about the nature of the political challenge ahead. It is going to cut deep into some of our assumptions about what we need to do as political activists. That's not a green part. I'm not making a party political thing. I'm just saying, I think maybe I'm framing this badly, but I don't think you can be a climate activist if you're not prepared to get involved in the cut and thrust of the politics of it.
Absolutely. And as we think about, the role of elected leaders and people who do hold enormous power in this current system, one of the great realizations for me as I began to engage in politics and also with big businesses and in boardrooms was that my beliefs around their intentions and often their malintent, I was forced to kind of unpick them and allow them to disintegrate to a certain extent, because as much as there has been, enormous vested interest, as much as there has been this very malevolent push to perpetuate the current system, equally, I've had so many conversations where the same self-limiting beliefs and stories and excuses that I'll hear working with 11-year-olds. I'll also hear, you know, with the leaders of these enormous multinationals. And I know you've had this experience as well. And it's striking because from the outside, you see the enormous power of a company that touches billions of lives every day, right? You see the power of that hierarchy, but you also see how it cripples people in those positions of power. And often you'll have conversations with individuals within these organizations who have so much positive intent, have had those difficult conversations at the dinner table with their children, but are looking at their role in kind of maintaining the status quo and are saying, well, where on earth do we go from here? You know, and you hear these stories on repeat. I'm too small to make a difference. It's not up to me. This disavow, right? Pointing the finger at someone else. In business, it's toward politicians. In politics, it's toward business. And you.
So Clover, I want to ask you, because those stories drive me mad. So when you hear that in a boardroom where you're surrounded by all the conventional trappings of what it's like to be a big influential business, how do you deal with it? Particularly, and this is the one that really bugs me, when a senior executive, a chief executive say, well, I am really interested in this because my kids are giving me a hard time at home. How do you deal with that without exploding in front of them?
Sometimes I have to do quite a bit of mental gymnastics, Jonathan, to keep my marbles. I think first off, there is a spectrum, and it's recognizing that in many of those spaces, there is really positive intention. But on the flip side of that, there are a number of people I've engaged with who, I don't want to say are unhelpable, but who so clearly need to kind of be toppled and have new leaders come into positions of power. And that kind of realization came into stark clarity when, for a short time last year, I was working within an impact fund. And I found myself in the boardrooms of, you know, Wall Street bankers. And it was, interestingly, my first time experiencing true misogyny. I was being talked down to, you know, not just as a woman, but as a young woman. And I was being condescended to about why the most effective climate solution was actually fracking. And it honestly gave me such an emotional hangover coming from the world, this kind of safe silo, safe bubble of people who care so deeply and are campaigning so actively on these issues, to a level of denial that I hadn't previously been so acutely aware of. So those conversations are really difficult. However, within working with some of these big multinationals, one of the ways that I found you can break through is in questioning, again, the story of powerlessness. So we all subscribe to it at different parts of our lives and different contexts, but the belief that I am powerless to take action, to create meaningful change, to shape the future, whatever that might be. And you see it as something that's very prevalent within these spaces, because when you've worked within a very hierarchical organization for a long time, it inculcates a sort of obedience. You learn that the primary motive is to maintain the bottom line. You're ultimately beholden to your shareholders, not your stakeholders. And I found the only way to break through is to be kindly challenging to some of those stories, to bring them into awareness of how they're drinking their own Kool-Aid, and really connect them to the emotions. And what is interesting, and I'm sure you've seen this as well, is that a lot of these leaders, for them, their catalyst was their kid coming home at the end of the day and saying, you know, what are you doing about climate change? So they probably won't respond to Greta Thunberg kind of giving a impassioned speech. But if it's their 12-year-old saying, this is actually do or die, and this is my future you're talking about, you can see a really, really significant kind of shift take place. And we are seeing that in the corporate space, and we're seeing it as well from like a very capitalist perspective about how disruptor companies, purpose-driven companies are able to attract better talent because young people are more invested in working for companies they believe in. And we're seeing them take away market share, which ultimately is what is kind of going to wake them up a little bit. But all of that being said, And as we focus on this kind of concept of stories and stories that we subscribe to, I'd be really curious to hear from your perspective, Jonathon, what you believe to be the most dominant and dangerous story in society that we need to completely rewrite if we are to deliver on this future that you lay out in this book.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by this notion of sort of countervailing narratives, of needing to come up with stories that not just allow people to see why our current story is so utterly destructive and dysfunctional, but simultaneously allow them to see that there are not just much better stories, but stories which lead us to a much better world. And that, I suppose, has been the nature of my work now for quite a long time, which is how do you create these narratives? And I wrote a book called The World We Made, where I tried to tell a story about what the world would look like in 2050 if we did all the things we needed to do it, how bloody brilliant it would be to be living in that world in 2050, because it would be pretty much everything that actually deep down the vast majority of human beings on this planet want. I mean, I don't need to run through that, because every time you do a workshop around this, everybody comes up with exactly the same things, and it's just astonishing. And you can do that over decades, you get the same sense of what would make life better for so many people. So telling that narrative is a really big thing, and I keep coming back to that. We haven't yet succeeded in using our alternative narratives to break down the incumbency power of today's dominant narrative. And that is because, for a combination of reasons, people have come to believe there is no progress for humankind unless we have economic growth. And the only way of having economic growth is to sacrifice many of the things that make life good for people, to sacrifice what it is to live well in our communities, to sacrifice the foundations of life on Earth. And those all become acceptable collateral damage, because if we don't accept that damage, we won't get growth, and without growth, we won't have progress. And that is so deep-seated, so pernicious, so hard to combat. So, and we have not made much progress on that, Clover, let's be honest. Over the years, we've not really dented that orthodoxy. There are, all sorts of exciting alternatives emerging now, but we've not really dented that. So we have to go after that as part and parcel of this. I call that a meta-narrative, because if you can get that established as a very unorthodox, subversive way of rethinking what it is that makes most decision makers and people of influence do what they do, then you can hang any number of better stories as long as you can change the meta-narrative.
Absolutely, and identifying the myriad future stories that exist within that broader kind of narrative.
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
it's a trap that I fall into all the time, where I talk about the better, brighter future. And again, that's one of the biggest problems in this space, right? And it's equipping people with the tools to be able to plot that path themselves. And one of the questions that came up earlier was around your recommendation for the kind of career or job trajectory that someone should pursue if they want to engage in this. And I think I'd be curious to hear, as we've talked about, the reinvention of capitalism and rethinking value in society and all of these very macro concepts, where is a good starting point on a personal level to first maybe unshackle from some of these meta stories, write new ones, and what does that look like by way of actively solving for the problems and stepping up and taking action?
Yeah, there was a point in my kind of, when I was at Friends of the Earth and sort of more radical days, when people would say, oh, I really want to do my bit for the environment. How do I get involved in Friends of the Earth or Greenpeace? And I'd say, don't, on no account, join this. Go and become a banker. Go and join BP or Shell. Take your passion, bring it to bear on these centers of sort of orthodoxy, and see if you can make the change from inside. I don't say that any longer. It is too late now to bring about that process of change. So I would never suggest to anyone, go and join BP, because you might have a civilizing influence on them inside a company that has turned its back on literally countless opportunities to be a force for good, rather than one of the most destructive entities on planet Earth. Don't do that any longer. The days for that have gone. There is a sort of thought that you might want to get involved in financial services for a bit to learn how that utterly pernicious system works, then get out of it while you've still got a soul, and use all of that knowledge you have to subvert how capital markets work. Because, Clover, you know this at your relatively young age, just as much as I know it at my relatively old age. It all comes back to capital markets. It all comes back to what the money is doing. And I can't turn away from that reality because we've got to address that. Happily, there are more and more people who are realizing the power of capital could be deployed for very different purposes than those that it's been deployed for over the last few decades. So learn that the workings of that system, dysfunctional and pernicious though it is, and then take that learning and bring it to bear on using capital to create just and sustainable outcomes for the whole of humankind. Honestly, if you've got a brain that does money and figures and stuff like that, don't turn your back on having a brain like that. I only wish I'd had a brain like that, but it would have helped a lot over the years.
Yeah. Well, and I think there is something really powerful to that original piece of advice, which is worth holding on to, which I think something that I have had to reconcile in my own path to activism is this kind of savior complex. And I think it's very easy to fall into, but it's really dangerous territory. Because if you're doing everything in, pursuit of a specific outcome, if you're doing everything for the mission and you're constantly projecting your identity and yourself into that without getting the nourishment of doing what you love and are passionate about, then you're going to burn out. And I think it's terribly distressing to see it happening in young people who at such an early age are engaging in campaigning, but have their metric of success so wrapped up in decisions that are ultimately out of their control that when they don't go their way, it's very easy to kind of collapse in on yourself and to lose that motivation. So there's this real conversation that needs to happen around, just as the problems are myriad, so too are the opportunities. And that is just as relevant on a kind of personal level as well, in terms of showing up according to your unique skills and talents and passions, whether that is mathematics and finance, or it is as a communicator and a campaigner. This is very much the time when we need all of the solutions, we need all of the mobilizations. And for anyone who's not familiar with Project Drawdown, it's a great piece of research kind of unpacking many of the solutions proposed for reversing global warming. And it was a big eye-opener because it showed that, if you come in opposition to a climate denier who says, climate change isn't real, the case for just driving forward climate solutions are good for society anyway. It's like, things like educating women and girls and ensuring women have their reproductive rights and, protecting the most precious parts of our world, and so there's this real invitation to step up to that challenge and have a lot of fun kind of doing it along the way.
But Clover, I love the way you address that because it is so important. But you and I are both good colleagues of something called the Resilience Project, which is now, I hope, going to get off the ground to help young people as they fall into exactly that sort of terrible situation that you just described, where they've put every single part, young people put every single part of their being into this climate campaign, and then things don't change immediately, or it gets tough and things are difficult in their life, whatever it might be. And you can see any number of young people feeling the equivalent of burnout at an age in their lives where they shouldn't be going through that kind of trauma. They just shouldn't. And I'm increasingly conscious of that notion of emotional resilience faced with some of these extraordinary psychological and political problems is going to be a critical part of building the youth climate movement for the future. Because don't forget, we're not just talking about 7 million young people on the streets of the world's capital cities. We're talking of 70 million. We're talking of literally tens, hundreds of millions of young people who will be combining forces, I hope, with tens of millions of older people to force change in the political systems of which they're a part. And the emotional burden of that is going to be enormous. So the work that you're doing on that, I think, is really important. It's easy to underestimate that, but if we don't create the conditions in which young climate activists can actually prosper can be nurtured and the contribution recognized properly, so they don't just end up feeling, I can't do this anymore. That's going to be fundamental.
Absolutely. Now, to take a slight detour, as it's come up, I love those meandering paths. One of the questions that's just come up is around political sentiment in China and the role of China. It's certainly worth addressing because there's a significant part of the book dedicated to this one country. It would be great to hear your perspective, as you articulated here, on the role of China, where the greatest barriers lie, and what some of those huge kind of opportunities are with such massive, population and potential to lead international change.
Yeah, I'm so ambivalent about China. It's almost impossible to kind of work it out and stay logical in that space, because there's so much about China that I literally abhor. I just find it unbearable. I've been a supporter of the cause of Tibet for 40 years, and I'm still very actively involved in Tibetan charities because for me that was a relatively early signal of China's intent to use its domination to bring about a very different world order than the one that Tibet would want to be a part of and that we would want to see prosper. And now, of course, what's going on in Western China with the Uyghurs and the concentration camps for the Uyghurs is another example. So from a human rights point of view and a freedom point of view, much of what China does is, for me, completely abhorrent. And then I have to think about the contribution that China has made to some of the things that really matter. So I gave a little impassioned speech about the Renewables Revolution. Well, guess who made that happen? I can assure you we did not make that happen in the UK or the USA or Germany or anywhere else. The only country that made that happen was China. Suck it up, guys, because they went after that burgeoning global market for solar energy at such a point and with such incredible focus that they were able to bring the power of solar energy to the world in a way that otherwise we couldn't think of a decarbonized future. And solar energy is going to be the liberation of hundreds of millions of people across the world. It is that big. So look, I'm caught in this space, and I end the book by talking about what's going on in Hong Kong. One of the models that I look at is what's our equivalent. If you're a young person in Hong Kong today, and you can't imagine a future without some of the democratic entitlements you've had in Hong Kong up until now, then you take to the streets. You want to hang on to that because your sense of what a good future looks like is dependent on maintaining democracy. And the courage of those protesters throughout 2019 is quite extraordinary to look at. And now, very different story in 2020, a different level of oppression, and God knows what's going to happen there. But for me, that means we have to think about how we put democracy at the heart of this climate story as well, because without democracy, it's one hell of a challenge to make things happen. It really is. I have nightmares about China, Clever. So this is bad, and some of them are not such good nightmares. And I keep thinking, I always have these nightmares about terrible countries like the USA and China equally. And they usually end up in wanting something awful, so awful to happen to these countries without any loss of life, you understand, which shocks the entire system into a different place. So I basically want Florida to be wiped out with no loss of life by the next hurricane that will come sweeping in out of the Caribbean, okay? Just written off and submerged. Everybody evacuate. And then you look at the eastern seaboard of China. Oh my God, you look at what would happen if you had to evacuate Shanghai as a consequence of sea incursion into the groundwater around Shanghai. These countries are going to have to be shocked into a completely different sense of what emergency means. They're kind of halfway there. Well, China is definitely halfway there. America, 10% there, despite the fact that the lives of millions of people in America have already been dramatically disrupted by climate change. Dramatically.
And that's, I think that's
sorry,
reflective.
That was definitely off-piste. Cancel those nightmares, okay?
Well, I think it's reflective of the again, if we, talk about the language that we use to speak of climate and shifting from, being a siloed environmental problem to being the symptom of broken systems, to appreciating that the climate crisis is unique, as you talk about in the book, and that we're all, each and every one of us, complicit in creating it, which can be both debilitating and an enormous opportunity. One of the other shifts that I see, as we so often talk about, climate crisis as an issue that is impacting future generations, which of course it will, it again can act as a way of kind of blanketing over the suppression of communities of color around the world today, of the human rights injustices, of the forced immigration that is happening already due to desertification in China, due to, conflict that is exacerbated by a changing climate. And of course, it is to deny the centuries-long oppression and subjugation and commodification of indigenous peoples, of communities of color. And, again, it's a denial of the lived experience of, so much of the global South as well. And so I feel, that we're not going to be able to meaningfully talk about what it is that we're working toward until society kind of goes through this sort of collective acceptance and grieving process of how we've all been complicit. And I see the BLM movement as a very powerful indicator of that, because for the first time, many of us who have existed in our place of privilege have realized that it's not just about being, not being a racist, it's about being anti-racist and assuming that responsibility. And it's the same thing with climate. It's, I'm not going to be experiencing the adverse impacts for quite a few more years, but there are young people in the Maldives who are already experiencing their homes being swept away. There's already food insecurity in South America. There are already kids in Bangladesh, who are dying because of air pollution. So until we wake up in that way and reevaluate the way that we're talking about these big messy challenges, I think we're going to find it very difficult to deliver on what we all know is possible, but can sometimes feel so far out of reach.
I agree with you entirely, but there is a difference today that connectivity that exists now, that access to the lives of other people, is so radically different from the ways in which people tried to understand and empathize with reality for the lives of people in other countries in the old days. I mean, and I look at it now and it's just instantaneous. If you subscribe to this notion that essentially human beings are predisposed to good, not predisposed to greed, bad things and so on and so forth, then your predisposition to the better side of human nature can instantly connect you to the lives of people across the entire world. And it's not phony, it's not artificial, it's real, it's based on a genuine empathetic desire to make the world work better for everybody, whether they live in your own community, in the next door city, in a distant country, whatever it might be. And for me, that is a huge resource. I'm not sure we've fully tapped into it yet, but it is a huge resource. And Clover, it never used to be there. I remember when we wrote fundraising campaigns for Friends of the Earth, and we would laboriously find photographic evidence of dreadful things going on in the Amazon, and you kind of clumsily put it together in a weighty one-off report, which would be printed and then sit around on a shelf for a long time. Oh my God. I mean, it was hard to get connectivity, to persuade people to look at the world differently. Now it's instantaneous. And if managed well, it is a force for change of astonishing power.
Absolutely. There's this true solidarity among young people from all corners, and increasingly we're seeing this intergenerational exchange, which is absolutely critical. Jonathon, to start to wrap up, as someone who has been on the front lines of this movement, as an incredible campaigner, but also as someone who is so well versed in the facts and the science and the reality of the situation in which we find ourselves, finally, who is this book for? And what is the one thing that you want people to walk away with having read this?
The thing that finally tipped me into writing the book, because to be honest, the last book I wrote was back in 2012, and I was sort of pretty determined I wasn't going to write another book, actually. But the thing that tipped me over the edge was an encounter with a group of young people in a university. I'm chancellor of a university here in the UK, and a group of young students in my university who said they were completely and utterly astonished how my generation had spent decades. They weren't being personal about it, I don't think, but my generation spent decades doing practically sod all about climate change, and then had suddenly tipped into a state of mind where they ended up talking to older people saying, it's too late, there's not much we can do about it anyway. And apparently this had happened seamlessly, going from we can't do anything about it to we can't do anything about it because it's too late to do anything about it. And just talking to them, it kind of made me realize this is impossible for young people to navigate their way through that. So I really wrote the book of the anger I felt on their behalf. And therefore my publishers are always very nervous when you say my primary audience, but the people who I'd love to read this book are young people, because I feel that so much depends now on finding these ways of working together across generations. And the call to action, I guess, is a simple one, which is really all about sometimes just accepting that you can't not be political about this. There are all sorts of reasons at different points in one's life where politics is just a faff. You just think, oh my God, I'm not sure I'm cut out for political activism, and I don't know whether that's me or whatever it is. And unfortunately, that is the one thing nobody can turn their back on now. We have to do that bit. That would be my call to action. I'm not talking party politics. I'm just talking about political engagement to bring about the kind of changes that we need now.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Jonathon. I say this not only because Jonathon is on the line, but this is hands down the best book that I've read on climate. And as someone who often finds themselves vacillating between despair and optimism about the future, it's an incredibly compelling read and galvanizing read. So thank you so much. And I encourage everyone to find a copy. Joe posted a link in the chat as well, which will direct you to an order on Waterstones. And otherwise, thank you all so much for joining. I'm going to hand back over to you, Joe, and thanks again, Jonathon.